Welcome to the webinar on Redefining Performance Management. Jack Zenger and Joe Folkman, we're here to talk to you about some interesting data we have on performance management. We've noticed that many of our clients are taking a really hard look at their current performance management systems and redesigning them. I had an interesting experience, Jack. I was with a group of people. I was thinking about how many people had a performance review every year. It's billions, probably, billions of people. So I was with this fairly large group, and I asked the question, I said, raise your hand if you've had a positive, inspiring, motivating experience in a performance review. Mm-hmm. And a couple of hands went up. I mean, it was not 1% of the population in the audience. If you talk to a group of managers and you say, what is waste your time? Boy, this is at the top of the list. And so the idea that there's a lot of concern, a lot of criticism about our current performance management process, I think there's a consensus about that. And I think we can do better. So, Jack, tell us a little bit about what's wrong.
In a word, lots is wrong. One fundamental problem has been that performance appraisal and performance reviews and performance management has largely been looking in the rearview mirror. It's always been a historically oriented kind of conversation rather than kind of looking at the future and what might be what's possible. Second thing that's wrong has been that we know that it's damaged people's self-esteem. That when you rank people and you give them a number that describes that ranking, invariably the high performers are troubled. The people in the middle are not very satisfied. It's a way of demotivating lots of people. On the screen, you're seeing a list of what we deem to be what's wrong with performance review. I don't want to talk about all of them, but skipping down about halfway, there's more focus has been on recent events than the performance over the entire year's period of time. And so one of the big criticisms of performance management programs has been that they're very kind of recent in their focus. I guess maybe the fundamental complaint has been that this thing we've called performance management didn't really enhance people's future performance. In fact, it in many cases seemed to detract from it. Many organizations have allowed the compensation requirements of the process to drive the entire thing. And so it's being done largely to satisfy the people who want some precise evaluation to justify compensation decisions, so that in the event that you had to terminate somebody or in the event that someone got a particularly large increase, that there was some backup for that decision. We think that some of the policies that have been at the heart of many performance management plans, some have kind of referred to them as rank, spank, and yank. If you rank people and you punish the people who don't get the high ratings, and you terminate the bottom 10%, as some organizations historically have done, there's just a lot of angst and anger that has come about from that. And so many organizations have abandoned those. In fact, most have abandoned that. But we're seeing this trend to abandon or to change the fundamental performance management and particularly performance appraisal processes. The final thing I guess I would say, you see here on the screen the picture of W. Edwards Deming, who made this very important comment about the fact that when you evaluate someone's performance, the fact is that it's the system, it's the culture that they work in and the processes that they're forced to use that has largely accounted for the performance of people. He says 90 to 95% of performance is really kind of outside the individual's control.
And we've always known, Jack, that if we put a really good manager in a really difficult position, we generally see their effectiveness ratings come down on our 360 assessments. And And if you put an average manager in a really easy job, theirs go up. And so the situation you're in affects your performance. And if you really wanted to be fair, you have to look at the person, their performance, the situation, the job that they're doing. There's so many factors affecting our performance. What we've seen is as companies started to react to this whole issue that nobody liked performance management and nobody really thought it was doing much good, is some overreactions. A number of organizations have completely abandoned performance appraisals, relying on informal conversations. And, overcorrections can really seriously have some serious unintended consequences. And some examples of that are that some companies have eliminated all rules and just let people manage themselves. We had a client call up and they said they had done away with performance management. They had instituted a positive feedback. Everybody was getting positive feedback. And I said, well, how's it working? He says, well, it's great. The only problem is that sometimes people get promoted and nobody can figure out how that happened. So what was an obvious open conversation has gone to the back room. And so those conversations are still going on. It's just they're not with the employees anymore. Some have switched to new criteria for the appraisal, sort of asking, would you want this person on your team, or would you take this person to dinner, or does this person deserve the highest discretionary bonus? You're still giving ratings. I mean, I don't think that solves this whole problem. It's discouraging and it's not motivating. The other thing you've seen is some shifting to rigid goal setting. So the whole performance is based on accomplishment of objectives and really getting rigid around that. And if you hit this target, if you get this thing, then you get this kind of reward. Well, the reality is organizations need to document poor performance and justification for denying any compensation increase. One of the reasons that we have to do performance management is the legal requirements of letting people go or giving people high pay. And those need to be documented, and you need to be able to justify those in a court of law. But as you think about those only happen for a few people.
They're very rare.
They're very rare. And so we have an entire system, then we've justified it based on this exception of really high performers or really low performers. We're going to talk more about that. But the other thing that's occurring is that we're moving from a transparent process to one that's secret, where people are making decisions behind closed doors and all of a sudden stuff happens and nobody knows why. And people really are kind of not getting the story. So most organizations are looking for a middle ground here, some place where they can be effective but using a different process.
Our belief is that performance management in some form is here to stay. Just as the two people who raised their hands in this group that you were talking to said that they'd had some positive experience, we know that there are those positive outcomes when it's done very, very well. And we're going to talk about what needs to be in place for it to be done well. I'm not going to talk about each of the points that are here on your slide, but let me skip down to the one that says there needs to be some process to monitor people's career progress. People not only want to have feedback on their current performance, but also they want an opportunity to talk about the progress or lack of progress that they're making in their career and what they can do to kind of enhance that career trajectory. Performance appraisal does perform an important legal purpose in the organization around terminations and demotions, and so that has to be addressed somehow. And then just fundamentally, we know that employees generally want some feedback, and so it's how you achieve that in the best possible way. That's the focus of our webinar today.
You know, Jack, what was interesting is that even though that performance management process wasn't very effective, at least it forced a discussion. At least it forced a conversation between a manager and an employee. And when you take it away and you sort of say whatever, oftentimes you go to the worst possible scenario where that manager never talks to you about your goals and your achievements, and you don't have any discussion at all. And that doesn't work either, does it?
Not at all. Well, we think you'll find interesting these comments from two of our colleagues.
We'd like to welcome Maria Brennan and Crystal Zuckerman to the webinar today. They both work for Celgene, and they've gone through a process of redesigning and changing their performance management system. And we'd like to get a little insight from them about the research that they've done and how they've redesigned it and the impact it's had on the organization. So, Maria, Crystal, welcome. Could you give us a little overview of Celgene and what you do and the difference you make in the world?
So this is Crystal speaking, and Celgene is a global biopharma company. We focus on hematological cancers, and also we have a division of our company that focuses on inflammation and immunology. So we spend a lot of time being innovative and developing new therapies for conditions and diseases that people have throughout the world that are unique and that are underserved. So that's one of the greatest things about Celgene is having that passion for the patient.
You know, I've noticed that too. And the other thing that I've noticed about your company is the percentage of revenue that you put back into R&D there that's incredibly high. And I've really enjoyed my experience there. Well, tell us a little bit about this whole experience you had in terms of redesigning the performance management system and what you went from and what you got to.
So we started with a system that was very complex and didn't necessarily meet the needs of our employees and our managers in that it didn't necessarily give us the performance levels and the engagement levels that we wanted from employees. So as our business changed and as the environment internally and externally changed, we realized we had to look at what our existing performance management system looked like and create something that was more reflective of the way our business was changing and the way our goals and our objectives also changed pretty frequently. We also learned from other companies that there was a shift in performance management and how that was being handled, and there was a shift away from the performance scoring and labeling employees in different categories. There was a lot of research that supported that perhaps we should shift to a different way of managing performance. And so essentially we created a document, we call it a performance journal, that is reflective of those conversations that employees and managers should be having. We encouraged managers and employees to have those conversations frequently and to document them in this journal. The journal basically has 4 components to it. Those 4 components are goals or contributions. So what are you really focusing on throughout the year? What is it that you're working on? There's an area for progress. So managers and employees can go into the document at any point and capture the key components of those ongoing conversations and the progress against their goals. There's a section on possibilities, which is career aspirations or like a development plan or a learning plan. And then the actual learning plan itself, which should be outlining the steps the employee is taking to get to that career aspiration. So those are the 4 parts of that.
This is an open document, and the boss goes in there, and the manager does, and then the employees can add things to it also.
Right. They both have access at any time. So as an employee, I can go in and I can capture something that perhaps I just finished a big project and I want to go in and I want to put something about that in my performance journal. I can do that anytime. And my manager and I agree up front of how often we're going to meet, and then we may have a conversation, and then that would result in me adding comment or updates to the journal. And my manager could do the same. So it's open document all the time. It has no end date. It doesn't close out like the previous document. And it doesn't have metrics and weights and numbers that are tied to it. So instead, it's just literally a journal that captures my progress throughout the year.
So, Maria, what did you do about the rating? Did you do away with all ratings altogether?
You know, it's interesting. When we embarked on this project, we were trying to be very revolutionary. And our goal was, let's look at just eliminating, just based on the research we had done, we thought it was a really great idea. I mean, when we had presented to our executive leadership team, they weren't quite that ready to go that far into the future. I think that's something that we'll always kind of think of in terms of potential change, because we do want to try to separate out the performance of the organization and our achievement of goals and results from the highly interactive feedback culture of a dialogue between a manager and employee that focuses not only on getting the work done, but how well the work is getting done, what are the aspirations of that individual, what is their next opportunity and possibility. So it kind of opens up more the floodgates of back and forth interaction, coaching opportunity for the manager that they weren't really able to demonstrate in the process that Crystal shared, our former process, which was very time-bound and structured. So it restricted that free flow of information back and forth. So we still do have ratings associated. What we've done to sort of simplify the process is, rather than have a rating calculated out that can be anything from to give an example, we had individuals with ratings of like 128.65 when the calibration would be very challenging, because you'd be arguing over the differences between a 0.6 and a 0.8, and where at the end of the day there really wasn't much difference. Where now we consolidated to like a 9-point scale almost, with almost sort of bucketing, to different ratings that could be selected by the manager, not through a calculated formula, but through an overall assessment performance through the year and what makes sense based on the score. So much simplified, getting us closer to potentially not even needing that.
So you did a pilot on this, and what did you find out in the pilot, and what really made a difference for employees?
Well, one of the real interesting aspects was, we have this self-scoring component in the former process, and it, asks the employees, not much different from the journal, although the journal is sort of providing input to not just how well I've performed, but, information about the work that the individual is doing. But, for each goal, the employee would provide, specifics around and almost validity to the score that they are assessing for themselves. And it's so funny, even today, I was just having a conversation with a manager saying, new manager to the organization, one of our executives, and she's saying, how do I score myself? This is just awful, So it puts the employees in this position where they feel like they have to strategically provide this, potentially negotiated, score relative to how they've performed. And then the manager is put in a situation where they then have to contemplate, a reaction to that self-score. And it's either going to be disappointing to the individual because it will be lower than the individual's self-score, or higher. So that is one big change that we've done, is eliminated that self-score.
So basically the manager determines the rating, and what does that rating affect?
So it has a direct impact to the annual performance bonus. It is a calculated individual score that is built into the overall score that the company achieves, or in addition to that, for some parts of the organization, some functions and some franchises, an additional component, which is that functional or franchise score.
The other, I think, component that was impactful to employees in terms of the redesigning of the journal is that before the journal, we had separate places for people to put a development plan and separate places to put career aspirations and a learning plan related to those. And the journal, with those 4 components, put those all in one place. And so we'd always encourage managers and employees to have a conversation about goals, but to weave in a conversation about development when possible. And so the journal, having all 4 components together in one place, I think was useful to a lot of employees who wanted to have that development conversation at the same time they were having the conversation about their progress against goals.
How critical is the manager's skill in terms of, the system is always important and helpful or not helpful, but does the manager make a difference in this?
That's an excellent question, and that's one that really we took into consideration very strongly when we were designing the new program. The new program really does, we believe, require a high level of capability. from managers because, what they've done historically is they've relied on a scoring mechanism that pretty much spits out, a score that they can utilize and point to and say, well, gee, that's what the system came up with, so that's the score. And, with this new program, there's much more of a reliance on the manager really taking a step back and looking at the overall annual performance of an individual based on the multiple conversations and journal entries that have gone on and collectively coming up on their own with the appropriate score. So it puts a lot of accountability and onus on the manager because when they sit down ultimately at the end of the year with the employee and provide them with the feedback around the performance and the score that's assigned to that, they're going to have some real good, reasoning behind that decision because it's not as simple as, well, when we plugged in the numbers based on your 6 or 7 goals and the weightings, it comes out to this score. So there is a lot more of a responsibility for the managers to be effective in their evaluation of the individuals and their ability to effectively communicate feedback.
So if you were to look back with a little bit of hindsight, what are the big lessons you've learned that might be helpful to those people listening to today's webinar?
I think it's really important, and I think it was helpful. We had a lot of good guidance from our colleagues and champions for the program. But involve the employee population as much as possible. I mean, when we embarked on this, it was very important for us from a pilot perspective and we very carefully selected various groups from different parts of the world, geographically, different levels, different functional type of areas, because every group has somewhat of a different opinion about how things should go. And I think incorporating the feedback throughout really was helpful for us, not working within kind of a silo, an HR silo, and sort of saying, well, gee, this is what we think might work, and let's give it a go. It was really involving those participants very, very closely in the work as we went through.
Yeah, and I think I would say 2 things, and maybe more if I had more time, but I think one size doesn't fit all. So we spent a lot of time trying to create a perfect document that could solve for things that a document cannot solve for, a system cannot solve for. And so I think if people are embarking on this mission of creating the perfect performance management system, take that into consideration and kind of go easy on yourself because that's just not really possible to create something like that. I think also you can't underestimate the impact of your company's culture. So we were talking a little bit before about companies that have a really strong feedback culture. This kind of process may work better for them because they're more comfortable with those frequent conversations. Feedback isn't something they're scared of. It's part of their culture. And that's something that Celgene is still on a journey to get to. And I think we underestimated that at times. We had high hopes that a journal like this could have a big impact. And I think there's a lot of pockets of the organization where because our feedback is just not something we are highly skilled at, that had an impact on the success of the pilot and will have an impact on whatever performance management system we put into place going forward.
So it is dependent on that leader really stepping in and having good discussions and
Yes.
really having feedback. And probably the other thing that's critical here is the employee, right? There's people that are open to feedback, and there's the others that are hard to give feedback to.
Right.
Well, anything else you'd like to say in reference to this? So big learnings for you or observations from this process?
One thing I think I will share, and I think when we did this pilot, we were very focused on surveying the participants and asking them to provide not only, assessment of the different tools, but, how it's going and so forth. And we also gave them an opportunity to provide some, very open information, dialogue, text format, right, in terms of the survey. And the one quote I remember sticking out, we were all chuckling, was, the tool is only as good as the individuals who are utilizing it. And I think it was, to me, a very impactful statement because it goes to what you said before, Joe, about, the effectiveness of the manager. And I think, to me, it's the maturity of our employee population knowing that is very important. It's very critical. They realized using the pilot, that was a component that really had to be, worked on. And I think by us, dually focusing on the tool and the new program, and also looking at opportunities for manager capability support, doing that together really was very helpful. So I think that was my big learning.
Brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks very much, Maria and Crystal, for those useful comments. I would now like to take a spin with a different kind of organization, a large automotive manufacturer, many hundreds of thousands of employees worldwide. How are they going about this whole performance management process? What changes are they thinking about making? And so we'll turn the time now to a colleague from that organization.
We're excited to have with us here Kelly Cross. Kelly is a senior manager for talent and organizational evaluation at General Motors. And Kelly has worked for General Motors for 19 years and has a fascinating story. But we're very interested in what they're doing around performance management and how that is evolving and changing. Kelly, thank you for joining us today. And tell us a little bit about your experience at General Motors.
Well, thank you. We are so delighted. She even asked us. You have been such a phenomenal partner, and certainly we couldn't be where we are with this discussion today without the competencies and the strengths-based approach you've helped us with. So thank you for that before I even start.
Well, thanks.
So the journey is always about where to start. So I think I'll just go back a few years. My team manages the employee engagement survey, and one of the things that when Mary sat in the, Mary Barr, our current CEO, who is as authentic as you believe her to be in interviews and TV, we were sitting there as part of HR as we emerged and were rebuilding today's company. We were talking about how do you restore trust with employees, and so we implemented GM's first global engagement model. It was the first time we asked all the employees around the globe, about 65,000 at the time, the same questions to learn the same things. And of course, like most companies, we slice and dice the data, hundreds away. And, if we create a chart showing east, they all want west and north and south. So all my data friends are smiling, having lived that life. But one of the things that emerged was across the globe in all 65 countries, we had a concern about career management. Does my future opportunity look good here? And is there a place for me? And so we, of course, looked at that from individual contributors and leaders and realized that our first-line leaders were struggling the most, not just with their own personal engagement, but the tools and the conversations HR gives them to talk about career paths and discussion and give performance feedback in meaningful ways. And so we've really been on like a 3 or 4 year journey. It started from the data from the survey, and then we carried it through a couple of cycles. And while we're increasing and getting better, and as a company we've improved our engagement 50% over the past 3 cycles, and that's incumbents are about 70% of that. So this is engagement is shifting forward. That personal connection of how do I fit, how am I doing at the company is still top of mind for every employee, regardless of level.
Well, you've made a lot of changes to that system. What fundamentally, how's it changed from the old system to the newer system?
Yeah, I would say we've changed it less from an engineering's dream of what a performance management system to be, to kind of the best-in-class practices of the HR professionals in the academic world. We're a STEM organization. We will write any algorithm you want, and we've come to realize that we are so much better at making vehicles and changing the world's perception of mobility than we are at writing performance management systems. So that's why we seek great partnerships with organizations like yours. And so we've simplified it incredibly. It went from some kind of map that you needed a color code to 3 simple conversations a year really meant to guide discussion. And so the first part, goal setting, are we all aligned as individual contributors with the team and with the company's goals? Mid-year, we focus on not just progress to those goals, but Really encouraging. In fact, it's a mandatory discussion. We say something much nicer like highly recommended discussion where we talk about your career and the past and the opportunities that will give you the skills and the competencies you need to move forward, and also allow the employee to kind of say, well, this is what interests me, or this is where my passion is, and have that rich dialogue and what developmental opportunities, whether they're traditional learning opportunities or just on-the-job experience, happens at mid-year, and then we close out the year-end with a discussion of how did you do that performance calibration. And, you know, if you've, Mary is, one of the advantages of working inside General Motors is that when she's quoted, we can get her clarification at the next All People meeting. And so one of the quotes I know many people have heard her say is that she doesn't like the word culture. And she will be the first to clarify. I've sat in many a room where she has clarified this with employees, is that what she means is culture is really a word about how do we behave, because otherwise it's just something on the wall, but it's truly how do we behave. That's what builds the culture. And she always clarifies that she loves culture, and she's been an amazing champion of culture, but really kind of blessing that conversation about it's really how we behave. So as a company, we're so focused on not just what you get done, but how do you get it done. We're talking about how do we build hungry and humble employees and leaders as we shift to this world of not just being about vehicles, but about mobility, because, you know, you earn customers and you earn employees who keep coming back, and you do that through a culture of collective behaviors. So we're really looking about what that means for performance management.
Now, those three discussions, goal setting, career, and then the final performance discussion, is that documented? Is there rating scales there, or do they take notes? I know the system is a part of success factors that it's implemented through the
Correct.
internet there. Could you describe that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a really simple tool. In fact, we were just talking to the HRIT team about, you know, the 2017 deployment plans, and they said, you know, this is our most simple build because it's really meant to drive the dialogue. And then we do have, you know, the more formal, you know, did you have a conversation? Did you check the box? Year-end comments. So the tool is just the facilitator of the conversation, where before we had this and encouraged the one-on-one conversations. So many hours were spent updating the tool that the employee and the leader were not speaking. And, you know, we're a global company. Half the time you're reporting to somebody that you're not sitting near you. And so this conversation, this human element, whether it's by phone or in person or when the leader travels to the country, it's giving everybody that required pause to stop and have those conversations that are so meaningful to employees.
Well, and that system sounds great, but you've now even done some experiments looking at some optional ways. Could you tell us a little bit about these pilot tests you're doing and what you're testing out and what the results of those are?
Absolutely. You know, one of the things we want to do is stay relevant as we attract, and also for our loyal employees. I never call them old employees. We've got employees that have chosen to come here for 30 years, 40 years, and they still come and they're still engaged. So it's not just about engaging those that are new, but keeping those that are loyal engaged. And we realize that when we have even the most simplistic, well-intended ratings of, you know, we've got 3 ratings, employees are hearing them as grades. They're hearing them as pass or fail. They're hearing them as you love me, you don't know me, and you hate me, right? Like the extremes. And I think that's something that as we listen and, you know, read the employee feedback and read managers' frustrations saying, I wanted to tell them this, but I had to give them this term. So today, I'll be very clear, we're still using what we have. We still have ratings. They feed into our performance discussions, the performance discussions feed into the compensation discussions. We're still there. But we're also highly aware that this is actually disengaging employees and leaders who are feeling they're being forced to have a formula conversation instead of a developmental one. And so we're running a series of experiments through the last part of 2016 and the first part of 2017, where we're looking at all the iterations we're reading about, in all the great academic forums, where we're hearing from vendor partners, where the thought leaders are telling us of, hey, other companies are doing this, or other best employers are doing this, and we're really trying to say, will that work here? Is this meaningful? Does this answer the gap? And so we run different employee groups through the experiments. We look, I guess we should call them pilots, but they're not even as formal as a pilot. They're meant as prototypes. If you know the design thinking world that comes out of Silicon Valley and innovation, the idea is test what you're least sure of, and you'll learn more than thinking you've got this perfect solution. So the 4 things we've been looking at, and we really look for intact teams, not just, random employees, but how does this look in the team environment? How does a leader feel when he or she has their whole team going through this new performance conversation? We find that to be way more meaningful. And so we're looking at, one group's running as the whole company's running. They get performance ratings. They get them every month. Another team's doing overall check-ins where they just have the conversation, but they don't get a performance rating. One's having it with developmental conversations, so it's not just about how you did, but what you can do better. And one is having the development with no rating, meaning like, okay, I'm going to give you all the feedback I will, but the last word you hear from me isn't your A, B, or C. It's what can we do to help you move forward? And so we've been studying that and seeing very different results. And the feedback we're seeing early on here is employees love the frequency of having the conversation. And the 2 groups without ratings are perceiving their performance and their commitment and their career paths at the company way more positively than those that are still in the more traditional route.
Your explanation for that is for why those 2 groups are better?
Yeah, I think it goes back. We did before we started any of this, we did what we call a collab. It's a design thinking, human-centric approach to design. And so we took HR professionals, but mostly other employees, and we kind of opened up our HR data, and we said, not the people data, but the feedback we're getting on our HR systems, and we said, here's what you're telling us. Can you go help us refine what this topic is? What is it really about? And one of the things that I think surprised my team and I the most is that employees, they came back and they were as interested. The feedback we got through this, kind of structured brainstorm was that people want to know, how am I doing in relation to all other people at my level? So if I can put that in a General Motors term, it's like, if I'm an entry-level engineer, how am I doing against everybody else in the brake department or in, this systems area? They want to know how they're doing against those who they're competing against to move forward. And then more interestingly, everybody felt like they'd already gotten their feedback from a leader. A good leader is already giving feedback in the moment. That's one of the things we try to teach and live here at GM, is that if you wait till year end, it's just so much more emotional than if you just told them about what you noticed in March, right? So that's part of our evolution to being real and being honest with each other and not waiting for formal mechanisms. And so a good leader is already telling you how you're doing. What the employee insight is they weren't sure what their team thought of them. Were they pulling their own weight? Were they delivering what was expected? Did the team think they were smart and extraordinary and building on their own skills? So that was really interesting for us, regardless of age or level or tenure, was this insight that I need to know not just what my leader thinks about me, but if the team thinks I'm doing well and pulling my weight.
Wow. Well, you haven't got to the conclusion yet, but at least the initial findings are pointing towards the people actually prefer the non-rating scenarios. There's not a number, but the key there, I think that the insight there is it's the more discussions, the better, and that having those discussions really is the helpful thing. Is that the conclusion?
Absolutely. I think we're going to probably play with the frequency. The employees love it monthly. The managers, depending on your span of control, it's, calendaring becomes a question, but everybody, manager and employees, are feeling that the value is in the reminder to sit and not just talk about the project, not just talk about the budget, but to pause and really give feedback. One of the next things to test is upward feedback, how our employees feel about giving performance feedback to their own managers. So that one we're really excited to learn a lot about. HR might be more excited than the leaders that volunteered on that one. But I think you're absolutely right, Joe. The discussion is more about, do I bring value? Are you seeing value? And what can I do to not only help myself forward, but help the company forward? And so I think that's the preference. And the ratings, however, whether it was the legacy of what we were trying to fix or the awkwardness of a new framework of discussion, they were really perceived as, you had to put me in a box and you think this of me and I'm so much more. So really looking at that whole employee experience that's kind of a soft term. But my team and I, we like to coach quite a bit that, you have to recognize that performance management is where the professional meets the personal. You can be really proud of what you've done and your metrics might be through the roof, but when you're sitting across the table from somebody you admire and respect and who controls your comp or controls your next career step, you're vulnerable. And so I think as HR professionals, we just have to recognize that personal moment in that professional structure and help them move forward. So we're not sure if that means ratings. We don't know if that means discussion or what, but we're excited to find out.
Well, it is a journey. Kelly,
absolutely.
Thank you so much. Congratulations to you and the other people at General Motors on building some great products. Actually, Jack and I went to lunch today with one of our colleagues, and he's showing off his new GM car, and it's like it's got all these things in it, and he starts to go to the other lane, and it beeps him. He says, "I love this." So congratulations on a great year and building some great products there, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you.
That was a very interesting both examples were very interesting, Jack. And what I kind of found fascinating here was both organizations looked hard at different ways to do that performance management. Did you feel that either organization had the right answer yet?
It felt like they both saw themselves as being sort of in the interim, that this is an interim decision, that it wasn't quite fully baked. And my prediction is that it's going to be in a fluid state for quite some time.
Yeah.
That we're going to see organizations struggle with this to come up with their own solution. What
I like about what they did is rather than just changing it, they tried some different techniques and studied it, and I really think that was really some interesting results.
So as we've thought about what can we learn from both these two organizations and others that we have contact with, it sounds like where organizations are going is, how do we develop a system that is accurate and fair? When we leave it solely to the manager by himself or herself to evaluate the performance of somebody, and particularly to reduce their performance to a single Arabic digit or to one word, it doesn't feel exactly accurate and doesn't feel totally fair. There's been this old comment about, when Peter tells me about Paul, I learn a lot more about Peter than I do about Paul. The concern has been that the manager's point of view, the manager's standards of performance, may be equally as important in determining someone's rating as the person's actual performance. So how do you get away from that idiosyncratic manager's influence of how high or how low an evaluation is? As Edwards Deming said in the earlier slide that we showed you, individuals' performance is very much a function of the system or processes in which they are working. So the recommendation number one is, how do you design a system that is accurate and fair?
The second recommendation is it's got to be efficient. I think the criticism that we have to quit running the organization to do the performance management really gets at the heart of this in terms of we've got to make this simple and easy. What I like about both the examples of the companies we asked to kind of comment on this is that they were both trying to use automated systems to capture these things and to make the system flow faster. You know, the simplification of the process from having these very detailed ratings down to the second decimal, that kind of stuff going away, and really trying to really create the language around something that's simple, something that's easy, something that's understandable, but also a process that works fast.
And the third quality that's clearly needed in this is that the process be inspiring and motivating. As a person who's been around this profession for more than 50 years, it's been interesting to see that over that almost the entire span of that time, that some of the leading thinkers, both inside the human resources arena, but many on the outside, people like Peter Drucker, Edwards Deming, Joseph Juran, the quality experts, they were always critical of performance appraisal because it had the opposite effect. It demotivated people. It was not inspiring and motivating. You know, we think about marathons. You know, what is it that causes people to go run a marathon? It isn't that they think they're going to win the first place. For them, you know, taking part in the event, finishing the event, beating their own personal time, that's all sufficient reward and motivation for participating. And there's inherent motivation in our work, and if we can help people capture that, see how what they do contributes to the larger, broader goal of the organization, then the whole performance management process can take on a more inspiring and motivating quality about it.
I think the goal of the performance management should be to elevate performance. And as you think about traditional performance management practice, they've focused on meeting minimal performance expectations, rating people on a variety of competencies or values or something like that, and sort of saying, did you hit this, did you hit that? Instead of saying, what would really, how could you do a great job here? What could you do that would be exceptional? And really trying to sort of set that idea of each person sort of finding that thing that's going to help them discover their genius and really elevate performance rather than just meet some minimal criteria. It's interesting, when you set a minimal criteria, people just go, check.
Yeah, right. I'll work to that. Mm-hmm.
They work to that. They don't go beyond it.
In talking with our clients, it's become clear that many are recognizing that for this newer kind of philosophy of performance management, for it to work effectively for many organizations is going to require some change in their culture. And some of those changes that they've identified are things like, we have to really believe that people can grow, that they can get better, that they're not fixed, they're not rigid, they're not set in concrete. Very much expressing this philosophy from Carol Dweck, the professor at Stanford University, about mindset and that people really are capable of progressing. There has to be in the culture a preference for transparency, not secrecy. And it also requires that people know and are supportive of the overall strategy of the organization, that this is not something held close to the vest of the people at the very top of the organization. Consistently, we hear people talk about there has to be a culture of trust and collaboration, not competition, existing within the organization. And finally, I guess we would add that there's this understanding that people's progress and development is not something that's solely the manager's responsibility or even solely the individual's responsibility, that the team has some opportunity and responsibility to help in people's progress. And when those elements in the culture combine, then a new pattern of performance management can take place.
The sixth recommendation here has to do with the relationship to compensation. Now, I think this is where the starting point for why we do it. And typically, people have thought about this whole performance management system in relation to a normal curve. And so if you think about a normal curve in a 5-point scale, you're going to get a few 1s and a few 5s, and most the other ratings are 2, 3, 4. What's interesting about that is that we've already discussed the idea of getting that number is not motivating, and it's discouraging to everybody. But both McKinsey and Josh Bershon wrote an article on the fact that we're thinking about this wrong. That really the performance management issue and the relationship to compensation is there's really only two groups that it benefits. It benefits those at the top of that curve, those people that are creating exceptional value. Most of the research demonstrates that there are these people in the organization that will create 10, 20, 50, 500 times as much value to your company than the average employee. For most employers, they're trying to figure out a way how to pay them more or how to get them more stock or how to get them more opportunities, because losing those employees would be very devastating to the company. So if you think about that group, the other group that we care about are people that aren't performing, people at the bottom of the curve. And there's another distribution. It's called a Pareto curve or a power law distribution, and it's also called a long tail. But the idea of this distribution is you've got it's spread out very differently, but really you've got a few people on one end and a few people on the other end. And if you think about compensation, and if you think about that, if you adjust your performance management system to deal with the ends of the distribution, and then don't try to make arbitrary decisions about the middle. Send positive messages to the middle. Don't say you're okay. Say you're doing great. Now, there's some people that are doing fantastic, but you're doing great. That's probably a much better way, I think, and Jack, we think, of doing this.
Yeah, certainly most organizations I've been in, the differential between compensation increases for that large group in the middle were in the hundreds of percentage points. They were not very big at all.
Oh, all that to demotivate them, right?
The seventh topic we'd like to just mention briefly is that there is great power in using multiple data sources, and we think this is one of the keys to having an effective, really successful performance management process. That some form of multi-rater feedback can really help alleviate this problem or this phenomenon of the manager having a somewhat idiosyncratic view of the subordinate's performance. There's been some good research done that shows that when you combine the manager's view, if you augment that with a couple of peers, two subordinates, then the manager's rater bias virtually evaporates. What is now being evaluated is indeed predominantly the performance of the individual. And so whether the manager uses some kind of a 360-degree feedback instrument or whether the manager collects multiple inputs from colleagues with whom this individual works, there's lots of ways of getting multiple data sources, but we think that is really crucial. The challenge is that you don't contaminate and don't lose the great value of the traditional 360-degree feedback process. So respondents, when they're responding to any kind of a questionnaire or assessment of a colleague's performance, they must know how that data is going to be used. Is it going to be absolutely confidential, or is the data going to be shared with the individual, and is it going to have some impact on his or her compensation, promotability, stock options, whatever? That just needs to be all upfront and very clear, very transparent as individuals participate. And that same thing holds true for the individual contributors benefit from having multiple raters, just like leaders benefit from having multiple raters.
And Jack, the thing we found when we looked at data, 360 feedback where it was given to the manager of the person receiving the feedback, some people say, well, you then get a response bias that people only rate positively. We haven't seen it. We haven't seen it where it was used developmentally. And I think that's the key. And in fact, that's the undergirding part of this conversation about this whole thing, is that performance management ought to be more developmental. Now, what's interesting in the process here is I hear a lot of organizations say, we're not going to do performance management anymore. We're just going to have coaching. And I go, that's a great idea. And the only problem is the assumption that all managers know how to coach. And all managers are good coaches. In fact, Jack, we did a blog this year where we looked at whether a coach could predict their effectiveness. And we found that 24% of the coaches in our huge database, they over-predicted they thought they were great coaches, and they weren't. And it turns out that people that overrated their effectiveness as a coach, their average effectiveness at coaching was at the 32nd percentile. So what we are saying here is that if you're sort of saying, okay, we're going to not do performance management, but we're going to do coaching, let's get these people some skills. Let's teach them how to do it. And assuming that they just know how to do it is a faulty assumption.
Right, and that leads us to this ninth kind of point. That is that there are some skills and there are some tools that are required so that managers do indeed need to be trained to use this or any other system. So they need to be trained on how to be better coaches. They need to be trained on how to schedule these coaching conversations so that they don't fall through the crack. And there needs to be some way to monitor and give the organization some sense of whether or not these conversations are indeed taking place. 360-degree feedback instruments are especially useful tools in making all this happen. They have been shown to be really powerful tools in bringing about behavioral change, and they also have great promise to help in the organization's selection of leaders. But all of these tools need to be then understood and comfortably used by the leaders inside the company.
And Jack, we are just working on another piece of research where we found, interestingly enough, that giving positive feedback is a key to getting good performance review. And we're going to talk more about that in another blog soon. But it was really amazing to us that the leaders who had a preference for positive feedback, they were rated much higher on developing others and giving feedback. And again, that's a skill. And I think most people, they don't assume that. They have it wrong. And so learning that is an important part. The last thing is that you need to monitor this stuff. If you just assume that people are having these discussions, I guess Tom Peters once said that what gets measured gets done. Lots of people have said that, actually. But I think that's true. And if we're not measuring it, if we're not kind of following up, if we don't kind of know if these discussions are actually happening, the nice thing about the performance review is it was an event. It was a metric that went in. You could measure how many people had that discussion. I was always fascinated by the fact that organizations would tell me every person in this organization has had a performance review, but when we asked them on a survey if they had it, only 75% said they did. So you can imagine, I don't know where that other 25, they sort of were you not in the room when that happened, but that's always an interesting dilemma. But what gets measured gets done.
Absolutely. So in conclusion, let's just summarize where we've been. We all agree performance management needs remodeling, but it's not being tossed out completely. It should encompass some new processes that take advantage of the more immediate boss's view, but also collect the opinions and perspectives of other coworkers, other people with whom this individual interacts on a frequent basis. We've all agreed that good performance management processes shouldn't be always backward-looking, but should be looking forward. And rather than focusing on the minimum requirements for the job, that they should kind of explore the upper limits. What's the possibility? What could this person be doing? And how might you elevate their sights in their job? We believe that this remodeling process can preserve the positive elements of past systems and at the same time eliminate the major criticisms and meet the objectives of a more modern approach to performance management. We wish you all well in that quest. We suspect that you, like our two client organizations we've discussed today, will experiment, we'll try different things, but I believe that we're going to see some real improvements made in the general performance management process. Thanks for joining us on today's webinar.